A right-of-way is the legal right to traverse property. There may be private rights-of-way where you would have the right to cross your neighbor's property to get to your own property, but our rights-of-way are a little larger scale because they're for state highways. The right-of-way group's main mission overall is to acquire and clear property rights necessary for transportation purposes. Generally, that's highway right-of-way, but it could be maintenance camps, it could be facility sites, it could be material pits. Anything in the way of real estate that's needed for the department is acquired through the right-of-way group. The right-of-way group is composed of 7 sections. First is right-of-way administration. It's responsible for leadership and oversight of the right-of-way group. The right-of-way operations section is responsible for contract management, records retention, and financial accounting, the processing of payments out and the processing of payments in. The primary sources of money are residential or commercial rental properties that we own until those properties are cleared and used for construction. And then somewhat less known is our inventory of cell sites. Last count we had 85 cell site leases that net us approximately $1 million per year. A right-of-way acquisition section is responsible for the hands-on work with property owners in acquiring properties and also in providing relocation assistance to people or businesses displaced by our highway projects. The Federal Uniform Act spells out how all those functions are to work in order to safeguard the rights of the public. The state statutes mirror the federal standards, and those are the regulations that govern us virtually on a daily basis on how we value property we acquire, how we deal with property owners through the acquisition process, and how we provide assistance to those that have to be moved. Right-of-way Titles is responsible for researching ownership and encumbrances on any property that we may be purchasing. They also oversee State Transportation Board resolutions for the group and handle circumstances when ADOT must utilize its right of eminent domain when acquiring property. And they interface with the right-of-way plans section, delineating property to be purchased and developing the necessary legal documents needed for acquisitions and disposals. The plans section also arranges for the final right-of-way monumentation once the project is complete. The property management section is responsible for maintaining the properties that ADOT acquires, including the commercial and residential properties we rent out until either they are used for construction or sold off as excess. We mentioned earlier that the primary aspect of the right-of-way group is to acquire and clear properties. Demolition is part of that clearing process, and when we've acquired property that has improvements on it, it's necessary to remove those improvements so that we can provide a vacant, cleared property ready for construction. Occasionally on a project, we may acquire more property than is actually needed for construction. And at some point, usually after construction of the project, that property is declared excess and is offered to the public at market value. And the sale of that property comes back to us to be used on other projects. Our project management section follows right-of-way projects from start to finish, providing real property appraisals, appraisal review, and local public agency assistance. Right-of-way Group is primarily a real estate organization, but not in the sense of a private real estate firm in that we deal with real estate, but it's in the context of a much larger process, which is the development and maintenance of a state highway system.